opportunity for us. And we thank you so much for attending. I hope you will learn a lot about the Virginia Trail and the why, the how, and the where it is. We especially want to thank Norris Incorporated, Bank of Bonnetta, Virginia Humanities, and the Historical Society of Western Virginia for making this opportunity possible. It really is a pleasure to be a part of the lecture series. It is a pleasure to be a part of the lecture series and in honor of Bonnetta County's 250 plus 1 years of history. We do have a couple of board members here, I think, for the Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail Organization. Kip and Lynn Horton, who I'll be introducing to you momentarily, and Jim Johnston. You want to raise your hand? Jim is the treasurer of the organization. He is also my consultant and my fiance. So that's a good partnership to have for sure, isn't it? Joining me at the podium will be Kip and Lynn Horton, who for the past 10 years have served as the Bonnetta County co-chairs for the Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail effort. Kip is a retired naval aviator and retired commercial pilot. His wife, Lynn, is a retired teacher. They moved to Bonnetta County 23 years ago and have developed a keen interest in local history. They live in a restored log structure built in 1870 that sits on 100 acres of land about 4.5 miles outside of Fincastle. The Lewis and Clark and Legacy Trail has been part of their lives since 2012. Before we start the presentation, I need to mention a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that while I feel somewhat of an expert about the Virginia Trail, I am not an expert about the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, or what we refer to it as the Westward Trail. Jim and I just came back from a trip down the Columbia and Snake Rivers and following the footpaths of Lewis and Clark. And we feel like we're a little bit more knowledgeable, but I can't say that I'm yet an expert. I hope to be someday. From this presentation, the focus is on why there's a trail, how did it develop, and where the trail is today. Because we are celebrating Bonnetta's birthday, there is extra attention paid in this presentation to the county's history and Lewis and Clark sites, both current and potential. A fourth dimension of this presentation is to share some of the people connections the explorers had with other very prominent Virginians during their travels, and also connections they had within the ranks of the Corps of Discovery. So starting with this slide, why a Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail. History, going back to 1978. The Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, or the Westward Trail, was approved by Congress. This trail currently travels through 10 states, from Missouri to Oregon, and it offers recreational opportunities along the route. 40 years later, in 2008, U.S. Congress authorized the National Park Service to conduct a feasibility and a suitability study to determine if there should be an eastward extension of the National Westward Trail. Why a study? The first reason was because there was increased interest, I'm so sorry about this, increased interest in the whole life stories of Lewis and Clark. So in addition to the expedition, people wanted to know who they were, who were their friends, who did they marry, where did they live, and the personal facts about Lewis and Clark. Secondly, unknowingly, when they began the Westward Trail, it yielded unbelievable economic impacts to those communities along the Westward Trail. In fact, in 2017, J. Greg Smith marketing firm did a survey during which they learned that a range of economic impact on those communities was from $355,000 to over $20 million. That was something of interest to Congress when they were looking at extending the National Historic Trail eastward. The third reason is that the National Park Service during the early years, say as far back as 2007 and 2008, had begun to survey potential routes in Virginia and also historic sites in the eastern part of the United States that were Lewis and Clark connected. They found a high number of historic sites that were Lewis and Clark connected in the state of Virginia, and in particular in Bonnetta County that were along the Great Valley Road segment of the trail. Also in 2012 and 14, when we were just getting started, the National Park Service came to Virginia and conducted or facilitated 2 workshops for citizens who are interested in learning about how to develop and participate in the trail. And during that time, National Park staff offered comments that were very encouraging to those of us who participated, like, Virginia has it all, number one, and the second one was, the question you need to be asking is not when the tourist will come, but will you be ready? So why did Bonnetta County become involved at the local level? This is a story about an amazing moment, and it is a true story. The Trail Initiative began in November 2011. At that time, the County Director of Tourism summoned both the Director of the Historical Society and me to his office, stating that the county had been approached about attending a meeting in Charlottesville to learn about the possibility of a Lewis and Clark Trail in Virginia. I had just retired as Executive Director for Historic Fincastle Incorporated, and with that experience had gained some general understanding of the county's connections to Lewis and Clark, but not all. If we were interested in participating, we were told, we needed to prepare for the Charlottesville meeting. And one way was by completing a form that spelled out details about the county's history to both Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And oh yeah, by the way, we had until December 31st to do this. With the help of Weldon Martin, who was then Executive Director of the Historical Society and Museum for Bonnetta County, we did meet that deadline. Now the meeting in Charlottesville was not at all what the 3 of us expected. First, it was held in a tent placed at the spot where a future Lewis and Clark Exploratory Center was to be built. Second, it was held in the cold month of February 2012 at night. Third, the only heat being provided was by a few heaters scattered here and there. Fourth, there was no light other than what you yourself provided, which was 0 for the 3 of us as we were totally unprepared. And fifth, as much as one could see, it appeared that there were at least 100 people, possibly more, in attendance. All of a sudden, different groups were being asked to go to the podium to speak about why their group supported the Virginia Trail. And after 5 or 6 had shared their reasons, the next thing I knew, my 2 comrades had gently steered me to the podium. It was a very scary moment, but a moment that turned into an amazing opportunity. I started my talk by introducing myself, stating that I was from Bonnetta County, and specifically from the town of Fincastle. And with that short sentence, very unexpectedly, the entire front row of people, maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20, as I said, it was so dark, hard to see, that entire front row started clapping, and some even stood up. I was dumbfounded. I later learned that those enthusiasts were from federal and state agencies who had hoped that Bonnetta County would step forward and voluntarily become involved because of the county's significant history to Meriwether Lewis and especially to William Clark. Now, I do not have an image of the first map of the National Park Service that was on the National Park website. That first map, if you picture Virginia, that first map had, the National Park Service had posted Monticello and Washington, D.C. as the two most important sites for the Lewis and Clark Virginia Trail. But coming right down from Monticello, in little tiny writing with a line, a dotted line pointing to it, was the word Fincastle. So what they wanted was proof that Fincastle and Bonnetta County deserved to be part of a future westward extension of the National Historic Trail, or just to be part of a future Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail. It was truly an amazing moment for Bonnetta County. And a close association was established with the National Park Service, and as I mentioned earlier, they came to Virginia and conducted 2 citizen workshops in 2012 and 2014. At this time, I'd like to introduce Lyn and Kip Burton to come to the podium and talk about the amazing history of Bonnetta County in Virginia to the Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail, and the reasons that we learned later why our friends in that cold tent wanted Bonnetta County to become involved. Kip and Lynn?
Well, good evening. Good evening. I am Kip, and that's my wife, Lynn. And we are very glad to be here to give a brief review of connections of Lewis and Clark to Bonnetta County and Fincastle. We do have 3 well-known publications we brought with us tonight, so after the lecture, if you want to look at any of them, we have them up here. During the late 1790s Army experience, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark visited Fincastle, Bonnetta County often. From Robert Stoner's A Seabed of the Republic, which we have here tonight, Fincastle, and I quote, Fincastle being the last western outpost, Lieutenants Lewis and Clark had stopped there, often made many friends here, considered as members of the community. End of quote. In 1801, post-Army experience, Clark traveled to Virginia up the Great Valley Road to Fincastle, stayed with Billy Preston, who was engaged to Caroline Hancock. Through Billy, Clark would have met his future wife, Julie or Judith, Caroline's younger sister. William and Clark in the Shaping of the West was that publication reference. During the expedition in 1805, Clark named a river in Montana the Judith River. Peggy, I guess y'all probably went by there on your trip, didn't you?
I'm not sure about that. I wish we had though.
On the expedition's return date, September the 23rd, 1806, Lewis wrote Thomas Jefferson giving him his return right to visit him at Monticello. The route included Abington, Fincastle, Stanton, and Charlottesville. Lynn will continue the dialogue.
All right. So now I know how to turn the page. How you turn it? You want me to flip it? Okay. I don't know how to do it. Okay. They came many times, and the ones I have written down here are December 1806. That was they stayed until January 1807. William Clark was in Fincastle. That was after the expedition. And they were celebrating all over the country, of course, and Fincastle was very proud of them. And they had a big party, and apparently right in the courthouse, which of course was locked back in those days. And they had speeches. Everybody gave speeches, and it was quite a big to-do. And that was in December. In November of 1807, Meriwether Lewis visited Letitia Breckenridge on Groveville, right close to where we live, actually. And he loved her. He really wanted to marry her. He thought she was awesome, and she would have nothing to do with him. And it broke his heart. And not that many months later, she married someone else, whom he ended up, proving up. He ended up gracefully exiting. But as far as from what I've read, he never found another female that he was interested in marrying. So she was the one he wanted. In March in 1808, William and Julia Hancock married. Now, you probably know, if you've been studying on them, that she was young. She was like 17. I think she was like 12 when he met her and loved her, but he was 39 years old. And so her father, of course, had to sign papers, which are located here in this building. But on normal times, it would have been in our courthouse, which is going to be demolished, as you probably know, and rebuilt. And so I'm not sure quite where they're going to be located, but somewhere safe. But people come from all over to look at those documents in Fincastle, and they're sort of precious. But they are located right up here, right up the steps. Billy Preston then became William's brother-in-law, of course, because Kip had mentioned that William Clark and brother Billy Preston had married Julia's sister, her older sister. In September 1809 through May 1810, the Clarks were in St. Louis, and they came back home with the baby, Meriwether Lewis Clark. And on their trips, that was when they found out that Meriwether Lewis had died. And so they were kind of sad on their trip coming in. And I suppose that Peggy was just telling me that she figured Thomas Jefferson had a little to do with the fact that Nicholas Biddle came into Fincastle to help to gather the ideas that Meriwether Lewis had and put them into a book form. And so that all happened, and I think he finished that in 1812, but he worked on it with William Clark for about 3 to 6 weeks there in Fincastle. So a lot of his life with Julia, he was in and out of Fincastle. Of course, he was a busy man, but that is one of the things, and I will mention too that the guy that Letitia Breckenridge married, his name was Robert Gamble, and I believe he was a pastor. And they lived in Richmond. I thought that was funny. Okay, thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, Kip and Lynn have been the co-chairs of the Bonnetta County Lewis and Clark Committee for over 10 years. And that has been a blessing to this trail and to its development and implementation. Why else a Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail? Well, when the National Park Service completed their resource study, they actually found there were 24 Eastern legacy segments in the United States. Of those 24, 6 were in the state of Virginia. And of those 6, 2 included Bonnetta County. Segment 10, which runs along the Great Valley Road, is the major Lewis and Clark Trail segment in the state. It begins in Bean Station, heads all the way up the Great Valley Road, about 258 miles, to Augusta, and then goes east to Charlottesville. It is the longest state segment and has up to, already surveyed, 40 Lewis and Clark connected historic sites. The second route goes from Fincastle to Huntington, West Virginia. There are 4 other segments in the state of Virginia as well. None of those have been developed or organized yet. And there's possibly even another segment in eastern Virginia that would begin in Middlesex and include King and Queen County, then Caroline County, and go all the way up to Fairfax, Virginia. So why Virginia Trail? Another why. Because of the documentation. There was so much documentation about Virginia's travels. The letters that Lynn just read to you, or Kip just read to you, to Thomas Jefferson from Meriwether Lewis saying, we're going to come back to Virginia after the expedition, and this is the actual route we're going to be taking. And the second one is the journal, the personal journal of William Clark. And there were many personal journals and expedition journals for members of the Corps of Discovery, all of which, in one way or the other, have shared information about the connections to Virginia. These journals recorded where they stopped, who they visited, the number of miles, the prices they paid, and they made little comments as they went along. Another why of Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail. That's part of the mission statement and says, recognizing the Virginia connected members of the Corps of Discovery. When we first got into this project, I was always very curious in my readings about why William Clark always called some of the expedition members the 9 young men of Kentucky. And I really couldn't understand that because 8 of the 9 were Virginia born. So we continued to research and we learned that they were Virginia born, and there are many counties from which they were from. Now those counties are in the process of beginning to celebrate and recognize these expedition members were natives to their localities. There's already a sign posted in Stanton on behalf of John Coulter. The other thing that we learned about these expedition members of the Corps of Discovery, and especially these 11, was how interconnected they were. For example, Privates Joseph and Reuben Fields, who were born in Culpeper, their mother's name was Anne Rogers Clark. She was the older sister of William Clark, so she was their aunt. And William Clark was their uncle. Also, Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor and Sergeant Charles Floyd were first cousins. And their parents were Nancy Floyd Pryor and Robert Floyd. They were cousins, and they were also, all of them, cousins of Governor John Floyd, who was the 25th governor of Virginia. Virginia, but he returned to Pulaski County, where he farmed and he settled and he died. So now how, we're to the how part. How do we get from four organized participating counties in 2014 to 12 active counties and plus cities in 2020? And we were able to do that because of the grassroots volunteers' hard work and support, like Kip and Lynn, and because the counties anticipate economic development opportunities that they had never understood they could have before through this trail, and would bring enhanced tourism. And that, of course, was pre-pandemic. In the 2020 map, you will see the 12 counties outlined in black. The red are 15 counties that have yet to be developed or organized, but which we know were traveled and already have connections to Lewis and Clark. Here are examples of the county and city chairs and their activities. As you can see, they're representing Bristol, Rockbridge County, Lexington, King and Queen County, Middlesex County, and they are the engines that make this trail operate. This map is a new map that's featured on the website, on the Lewis and Clark Legacy Trails website. And it is interesting in that you can see 3 blue stars in counties Rockingham, Amherst, and in Caroline. These are 3 counties that are brand new to the trail because they have discovered that they have expedition members who were born in those counties. This is from the map on the website. And I encourage you to go to the website because a lot of what I am saying and much more you can find there. This is an interactive map that uses horse icons to designate the location of historic sites and locations that Lewis and Clark visited. These are all sites, too, that have been verified and approved as Lewis and Clark connected sites. If there is a 3 on that horse icon, that means that when you hit on it, all 3 locations around the Roanoke or Lexington area will pop forth and you will see exactly what those sites are. Now where, if you were traveling the Virginia Lewis and Clark Trail, where would you start? Well, the explorers entered the state of Virginia from different directions depending on why they were coming. And let me just say that more often than not, when they came to Virginia, it was because of 1, expedition business, and 2, personal business. More often than not, they were intermingled. So here, let's say they were coming up the Great Valley Road, rather than from DC or through the Cumberland Gap and through Lee and Scott counties in Southwest Virginia. They traveled from those areas as well, but more often they traveled through and up the Great Valley Road. This is the Robert Preston house on Walnut Grove Plantation. As you may remember, I mentioned connections. Robert Preston was the nephew of William Preston of Greenfield. He was taught the skill and art of surveying. He was appointed the first surveyor of Washington County by Thomas Jefferson. His son, Colonel John Preston, was a friend of William Clark. And in 1809, when he came into Virginia, William Clark had breakfast with Colonel John Preston. So let's say from there, he's traveling up the Great Valley Road, and he has to cross the New River. So Ingalls Ferry was established in 1762 by William Ingalls. The tavern was built on the Pulaski side of the river and became a very popular social center for travelers, including the older brother of William Clark, George Rogers Clark. William Clark writes in his 1809 journal, "Set out with Dr. and Mrs. Floyd." Do you remember that name, Floyd, as related to the expedition, the two expedition members? Set out with Dr. and Mrs. Floyd, crossed at Ingalls Ferry, arrived at Christiansburg, 12 miles. This structure is in very stable condition today. It's property that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is the oldest building in Pulaski County. Fotheringay, beautiful Fotheringay. Fotheringay was built between 1796 and 1815. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. After Santa Lane burned in 1812, between 1814 and 1815, the Hancock family moved to Fotheringay. From Clark's 1809 memorandum, and this also again relates to that journey that Lynn spoke of, coming from Missouri, a 9-month journey with William Clark's wife Julia, known as Judith or Judy, and their 10-month-old baby, Meriwether Lewis Clark. He writes, "Grass covered with snow, met Colonel Hancock, George, also James Preston, on the turnpike, much joy. They had finally arrived at the home of the Hancock family." Colonel Hancock and George returned, and we stayed all night at, and we don't know what Bots means, but at Fotheringay, which was 12 miles from the last location they visited. When they left Fotheringay the next day, they had to cross the Roanoke River, and more than likely they crossed it 2 times. The second time was at the little village of Lafette, where the North and the South Forks meet to join the Roanoke River. Clark, his wife, and baby were on the way to the Andrew Lewis home to visit William Lewis, William Clark's friend. Santa Lane, beautiful Santa Lane in Fincastle, built around 1795, where Judith, or Julia Hancock, and her 2 sisters, Caroline and Mary, were raised. The original house burned in 1812. The family moved to a temporary residence in Fincastle, not known exactly where, and then on to Fotheringay in 1813 to 1814. Bonnetta County Courthouse, another historic site on the trail. As Lynn mentioned, the documents for the marriage bond, which are currently here on display as part of the exhibit, are held within the courthouse and are a tremendous draw to visitors from all over the world throughout the year. The Bonnetta County Museum, another historic site, which currently features a year-round exhibit on Lewis and Clark. It also has the James Breckinridge Law Library, the original structure, law library included. The Breckinridge family being very, very close to the Hancock family and to other prominent citizens in Bonnetta County. Now, because this is about, we're focusing a little bit on Bonnetta, here are 4 potential other Lewis and Clark historic sites, or Lewis and Clark connected historic sites. One of them is Ingalls Ferry. The explorers traveled 5 different ways out of Fincastle. There are 5 roads that lead into Fincastle, and one of them was Route 11. which leads down towards today's Buchanan and across the river to what used to be Pattonsburg. Ingalls Ferry was the way you got to Pattonsburg. So this has the possibility of becoming another approved, verified Lewis and Clark historic site that will join the others on the website and become of interest to tourists traveling the trail. The next one is the Big Spring. The Big Spring is in Fincastle. It is a watering hole. It was deeded in the documents to Israel Christian by King George II to be included when he laid the plots and the plat for the development of the town of Fincastle. The house to the right is Grove Hill. We mentioned James Breckenridge. The reason, in addition to what I said earlier, Lynn touched on the fact that Meriwether Lewis had fallen in love with James Breckenridge's daughter, Letitia. And below that is what is known as the Hancock House. This house was built by Colonel Hancock and was used for artists who traveled throughout the region to bring artisan workmanship to homes and structures in the area. The Hancock House, some of us think, may have been the house that the Hancocks moved to after the fire at Santa Fe, mainly because it was not occupied all the time by traveling artists. Now, if you're leaving Fincastle, this next site you might want to see is what had been known as the Red Mill Inn, and now also known as McConkey's Tavern. Clark writes in his journal, he stopped there on the 3rd of December. He had 2 teams of horses, and he paid Mcconkey $1.57, and it was 20 miles from his last stop, which was in Fincastle. Continuing up the Great Valley Road segment, a visitor might want to go up to Augusta County to Stanton to see the John Coulter home where this historic highway marker is located. And then they may want to go move over to Charlottesville, Albemarle County in Charlottesville, to the Lewis and Clark Exploratory Center, where they can see this replica of a keel boat that was actually made at that center, where they can paddle the Ravenna River, which is right there, and where they can see other artifacts that came from the expedition. And more recently, and just as important, they can see that statue of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea that was in Charlottesville, which has now been moved temporarily to the Lewis and Clark Exploratory Center, for which our organization took part in working behind the scenes to help that happen. And then from Charlottesville, if you wanted to travel a little further, you could move all the way to King and Queen County and see the gravesite of Meriwether Lewis's great-great-great-great-grandfather. That, by the way, is a new discovery, just about 3 years old. So where is the VLCLT? Where is our organization? In August of 2020, we became finally, after 10 years, 12 years for some of us, but 10 years of operations, a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. We have a 13-member board of directors. The county chairs play a vital role, and various committees. And one of our committees right now we are greatly focused on, and it has to do with signage. Signage for all these sites that we've just mentioned, and the other sites that will be on the Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail. We estimate that during the year 2022, there will be a total of 15 historic sites that will need signage. And in the next year, another 15 historic sites that will also need signage. With credit to the signage committee of the organization, here are a few examples of signs that are being considered, have yet been approved by the board, but are being considered. One of them is what we call the Lewis and Clark portrait sign. Another one is the tabletop interpretive sign. Another one would be a historical marker that would need to be approved by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And the other one would be a disc marker. And all of these would be color coordinated. These are just examples of the signs that are being considered. Now, to help with purchasing these signs, another major activity the organization is having will occur on September the 18th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at historic Sandlane. It will feature our guest speaker, Betsy Merritt, who is Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We actually have hard copy invitations available to any of you who might like to consider attending. The event will feature examples of the signs, the historic sites that will be receiving these signs. There will be hors d'oeuvres and beverages, and lots of opportunity to get to know the Virginia Lewis and Clark Legacy Trail. Who are our trail partners? I could not leave this presentation without mentioning these people. The National Park Service, major contributor to the development and implementation of the National Park Service to the trail. The Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, who has just recently encouraged us to go back to the Virginia General Assembly this year to apply for funding that would help in part fund the signage that is needed. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources, the Virginia Tourism Corporation, and now the Virginia Department of Transportation, with whom we're working closely in terms of where we can place these signs. The Lewis and Clark Trust Incorporated, the Lewis and Clark Heritage Trail Foundation, national not-for-profit organizations, and most importantly, our local trail governments, businesses, and historical organizations. So, at that, the presentation is concluded. I thank you so very much for attending and for participating. Thank you, both Ashley and Lindsay, for your help before the presentation, setting up and everything. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to take them at this time. Yes, sir.
I've got 3 questions. Wikipedia lists Julie as a cousin to William Clark. Now, I know that the second wife, Radford, was the cousin to Julie, or Judith. Is that true, or do you know whether she was a cousin to?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak a little louder.
Julia Hancock
Yes,
is
sir.
listed on Wikipedia as being a cousin to William Clark.
Yes,
And the second wife was a cousin to Julia.
that's correct.
Was she actually a cousin to William Clark?
It has been stated that she was a cousin, but genealogically, I have never seen that proven.
Okay.
Yes, they were. Julia and the second wife of William Clark, after Julia died, were first cousins.
Okay. George Hancock died exactly 3 weeks after Julia, and it's said that they were buried together up on the side of the mountain, and he's watching over his health and all this stuff. But I've also heard that he died from grief from the death of because that was his favorite daughter. Is there any truth to that?
You know, that could have happened, but again, that's a fact that I've not seen published.
I heard a stroke.
Did you read it?
Said it was
Is it in the Stoner book? Okay, so if it's in the Stoner book, more than likely that's
Yes,
true.
he had a stroke. He had a stroke.
Oh, excuse me, Lynn is saying he had a stroke.
And there was something I read actually tonight about the cousin thing. That he, in this book, he was talking about that, but there were a lot of Clarks in Fincastle. There was like 4 or 5. And he suggested that perhaps it was a cousin was one of the other Clarks, and not, but he didn't seem to know either. So I guess that was sort of, they have to do a blood test.
Okay, the last question has to do with your trying to locate sites. Now, my question is, how would they get from Fincastle to Fotheringay? Would they go down Catawba Valley, or would they drop down into Roanoke around Tinker Mountain and go that way? Has anybody established which route
From
they took?
Fotheringay to Fincastle?
Right.
That is when they would have to cross the Roanoke River.
Right, but where did they cross over the mountains to get to the Roanoke River?
They would be coming, on this particular trip, they came from Christiansburg. They were coming up the Great Valley Road.
Yeah, they were heading back, and they hadn't gotten to Elliston yet.
They were,
heading-
well, the 1809 trip, and thank you for bringing this up. The 1809 trip was a very important trip because not only did Clark have his wife and 10-month-old son with him, but he had planned, as I said earlier, all these trips were mingled with personal and expedition business. His purpose of that trip was to go and see Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. Now, he did not know at the time, when he left Missouri, that Meriwether Lewis had died. So that was another reason that he had to go to Monticello and speak with Thomas Jefferson to talk about his death, and also for Thomas Jefferson to help figure out who was going to help write Meriwether Lewis's journals or interpret Meriwether Lewis's journals. So that was a trip that came up the Great Valley Road, that crossed the New River, crossed the Roanoke River, and then went on up the Great Valley Road, probably through Stanton and all the way to Charlottesville. Yes, sir.
Has any of the groups that are participating in your program tried to get the owners of Fotheringay to allow access to the structure so its interior can be visited?
Wonderful question. Thank you. If you go on the website, you're going to see pop up immediately a sign that says, because of the pandemic, there are certain restrictions to visitation. So at this time, still, because of the uncertainty of the variant, there are still those restrictions in place. However, it's being left up to each individual owner of the historic site. And the website encourages you to contact each owner before you visit. And that's still true today. And their information, the contact information for each owner, their phone number, all is provided on the website. Now, we'll tell you, before we put that restrictive sign up on the website, Santalin, all of a sudden, as soon as the website was completed, Santalin was enjoying, I'm going to use the word enjoy, but I'm not sure the owners would use this word, was receiving anywhere from 10 to 20 carloads of people driving in through Santalin every weekend. And that was one of the reasons that prompted us to put up, that restrictive notice on the website. Any other questions?
I may have missed it, but you were talking about the Kentucky boys, but they were all from Virginia. Do you know why they were called Kentucky boys?
Can somebody relate to what you said?
I can.
They were most from Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is in Louisville, and George Rogers Clark had moved down there, bought land, and these people from Virginia had come down here. There's a lot of Virginians out west. Sam Houston's from Fairfield. I just read about William Bucknell, who put in the Santa Fe Trail. He was from Augusta County. So there's a whole lot. That's why they called them the Kentucky boys. And you go down to Louisville, and they're real proud of that. So I'm a Kentucky boy.
But just remember, 8 of them are Virginia born. Any other questions? Thank you, Bert. Thank you.
This is just a statement. Have you contacted the Wilderness Museum up in New Bern?
Yes.
They're very helpful.
The Wilderness Road Museum and New Bern is part of the trail. They are the ones, through the hard efforts of April Martin and her research, that were able to document that expedition member, Warner. I always want to say Warner. Returned to Pulaski County after the expedition. The Wilderness Road Museum itself is on the trail. It's on the trail that the explorers took when they were coming, or one of the trails they took coming through Pulaski County. However, the Wilderness Road Museum is not a structure that has a very direct link to Lewis and Clark. So it's not a site that would be located on the trail, but a sign on the road in Newburgh about the expedition member who returned there, Warner, is being planned for that town.
How do you address the sites that were in Virginia but are no longer? And I'm thinking of the Fincastle Sweet Springs Turnpike, because according to Tommy Moore, who was a clerk, indicated that one of the routes was the Fincastle Sweet Springs.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Something about Sweet Spring.
You talk about Sweet Springs?
Mm-hmm.
Sweet Springs, which is north of Fincastle?
One of the routes, according to Tommy Moore.
Oh, yes, you're right,
that
they
route.
did. One of the routes. They traveled so many routes in the state. If you look at the National Park Service surveyed maps, and you just look at I mean, they were taking side routes all the time. And a lot of this was dictated by the weather, where they wanted to go, and really maximizing their travel time relative to the particular business at hand and their personal visits. It's just amazing that they traveled so much in the state of Virginia, and not only in all these localities, you know, throughout, but around different routes of each locality. It makes me even feel more amazed every time I see the maps. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
And real quick, before you guys head out, shameless plug, the book that was mentioned in the presentation, the visits of Lewis and Clark to Fincastle, we have some for sale upstairs in our gift shop. We love when you guys spend money with us, so please.
Who wrote it?
Yes.
Who wrote it?
Gene Crotty.
There you go.
So it is upstairs for sale if you want to get one on your way out. And then also is just a note, there is a gentleman here that is gone coast to coast along the Lewis and Clark Trail. His name is Bill Arnold, I think. Hopefully he's still here. He was here earlier. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions about going coast to coast, that is the person to ask. And thank you guys again for coming out tonight.